Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Twilight Bridge in Vermont. It was late evening in Vermont, the kind of twilight that seemed to stretch on forever, when the shadows grew longer and the world felt like it was holding its breath. I had been driving for hours, the long road snaking through dense woods that seemed to close in on me as the light faded. I was just a few miles from my destination, a small cabin I had rented for the weekend, when I saw it, the old bridge. The bridge was a relic from another time, a wooden structure that arched over a narrow river, its rails long since rotted away. I had passed it several times before, but something about it tonight felt different. I couldn't quite place it, but as my headlights illuminated the old wood, a shiver crawled down my spine. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the world around me was watching. I slowed down, my tires crunching over the gravel as I pulled to the side of the road. For a moment, I just stared at the bridge. It seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary, but something about it felt wrong. I glanced at my watch. It was just after 8. The sky had already begun to darken, the last rays of sun slipping behind the mountains. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the bridge, a lone figure shrouded in the deepening dusk. A man, I thought, but he was too still, too quiet. I couldn't make out much about him, his outline blurred by the fading light, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood there, staring down into the water below. I stayed in the car, the engine humming softly as I watched him. I had no reason to stop, no reason to approach. Yet, a strange curiosity gripped me. Maybe it was the isolation of the place, the quiet of the evening, but I felt drawn to him. As if the stillness of the scene, the eerie calm, called out to me. I rolled down the window, just a crack, and listened. The sound of the river below was faint, but there was something else, something subtle in the air, like a whisper, just out of reach. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it sounded intentional. A voice, low and almost pleading. Come closer. I jerked back, heart pounding in my chest. The voice was so clear, so real. I glanced quickly at the man again. He hadn't moved. His back was still to me, his focus on the water. But the voice, it was as though it had come from him. My instinct screamed at me to drive away, to leave this strange place behind. But something stopped me. The man's figure, dark against the twilight, seemed almost familiar. I couldn't explain why, but the pull was undeniable. Come closer. The whisper was louder now, clearer. And though it was just a murmur in the wind, it felt like it was inside my mind. I could feel my pulse quicken, a cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I took a deep breath and told myself I was being ridiculous. I had driven through these woods countless times, seen this bridge many times before. I had nothing to fear. Yet, as I reached for the door handle, a sudden chill flooded my body. Something was terribly wrong. I froze. The air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The whisper was gone, replaced now by a deep silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I looked at the man once more. He still stood there, unmoving, his back to me. His silhouette had become more defined now, his shoulders broad, his posture rigid. I couldn't help but notice how he seemed perfectly still, like he had been there for ages, waiting for someone. That's why I saw it. A faint, flickering light, something small, shimmered at the edge of the bridge, just beside him. It was barely visible at first, but it grew brighter, almost like a flame. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. But as I focused, the light seemed to shift, to bend, and it became a face. A face emerging from the shadows. It was a twisted, distorted face, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched wide and a grin that was far too wide for any human being. The light pulsed around it, flickering like a dying flame. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the face that wasn't quite a face at all. My breath hitched in my throat. The voice came again, louder this time, almost desperate. Come closer. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, my tires spinning as I raced away from the bridge. The image of that face, twisted and grotesque, burned itself into my mind, and I could still hear the faint whisper in my ears even as I drove miles away. But the worst part wasn't the face or the whisper. It was the feeling that followed me. That cold, creeping sensation that no matter how far I drove, the presence would be with me. That somehow I hadn't escaped. That something was waiting. And it would find me. I couldn't shake it off. Even as I pulled into the cabin's driveway, the chill that had settled in my bones refused to leave. I parked the car quickly, the headlights casting long shadows across the yard, but the dark was already deeper than it should have been. The clock on the dashboard read just after 8:30, but the night felt much older. I stepped out of the car, trying to force myself to breathe normally. The cabin looked just as I remembered it, simple, cozy, nestled between the trees, far enough from the road to feel isolated but not too far to be unreachable. The air was fresh, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt suffocating. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and headed toward the front door. But as I walked up the steps, I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder. The road was empty. There was nothing to suggest that anything unusual had happened. No headlights from other cars, no sign of anyone following me. And yet, something was different. My hand shook slightly as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the dim light from the porch spilling into the small, wooden interior. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't really alone. I set my bags down and went straight for the kitchen, hoping to find something to ground myself. But then I heard it. The faintest whisper. It was so soft at first that I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a creak in the house settling. But then it came again, this time clearer. And it was unmistakable. Come closer. My breath caught in my throat. The voice, that same voice from the bridge, was here, inside the cabin. It was in the walls, in the air around me. It was closer than it had ever been before, as if it had followed me, no matter how far I drove. I turned, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. There was nothing there. No one. But the voice, it was getting stronger, more insistent. Come closer. I backed away toward the door, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on me, thick and oppressive. The whisper seemed to echo from every direction, curling around me like a snake, tightening, wrapping me in its grip. I stumbled outside, into the cool night air, but the whisper didn't fade. It followed me, lingering like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. I had to leave. I had to get away from whatever it was that was haunting me. My legs felt weak, my body trembling as I stood on the porch, trying to force my mind to focus. The trees around me were still. Too still. The bridge. I had to go back. It didn't make sense. I knew it didn't. But that pull, that horrible, undeniable pull, it was stronger than my fear. The voice was calling to me, and it was as if something inside me had already decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my keys and got back into the car, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. I had to see it again. The bridge. The figure. The face. The drive back felt like a blur. The road was dark, the headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that had begun to roll in. It was colder now, the air dense with moisture. The landscape around me felt like it was pressing in, closing off any way out. There was no escaping it. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The bridge. Its silhouette cutting through the fog like a wound in the earth. I slowed down as I approached, my grip tight on the wheel. I couldn't stop myself. I had to see it again. I had to know what was happening. As I reached the bridge, I could see the figure standing there, just as before. The man. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just standing there. He was moving, pacing along the edge of the bridge, back and forth, like a restless animal. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I parked the car, the engine sputtering to a stop. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the river below. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaky beneath me. My heart was hammering in my chest. But I couldn't turn away. I couldn't leave. The man turned toward me, his face still obscured by the shadows, but there was something different about his posture. Something wrong. His movements were jerky, as though he was struggling to stay in control. And then, he raised his arm, pointing straight at me, his hand trembling. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, more urgent, more desperate. Come closer. My body screamed at me to run, to turn and flee back to the car, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen, caught in some invisible web. My eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, I saw something flash across his face. A smile. Twisted, jagged. Too wide. Too unnatural. And then the world around me seemed to shift. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, wrapping around the bridge, consuming everything in its path. The man was no longer just a figure. He was something else. Something more. Something that had been waiting for me. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, but nothing came out. The sound of the river was gone, replaced by a low, pulsing hum, like the beating of a distant heart. It was closing in. And then, I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder. A hand that wasn't human. I froze. My body locked in place, unable to move, unable to scream. The cold hand on my shoulder was like ice, its touch sending a jolt of terror through me, paralyzing every muscle. The hum in the air grew louder, like a pulse in the very fabric of reality. It was as if the bridge itself was alive, breathing, waiting for something. Waiting for me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct telling me to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't respond. The shadows shifted, deepening, stretching toward me like tendrils, and I could feel them pulling me in, tugging me toward the edge of the bridge. There, standing just behind me, was the man. But he wasn't the same. His face, if you could even call it that, was more grotesque mask than anything human. His eyes were wide, empty sockets, black as the void, and his mouth, it stretched impossibly wide, pulled back in a grin that was far too large, too eager. The teeth, sharp, jagged, and yellowed, seemed to glisten in the dim light, as if they were waiting to tear into something. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. And that voice, no longer a whisper, filled my ears, echoing inside my skull. "Come closer, it's your time." The words echoed, but they didn't feel like words. They were more like commands, like something inside me was being pulled and stretched, as if the very essence of who I was being unraveled. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. My mind screamed for me to turn around and run, but it was as if I had become part of the scene. As if I was meant to be there, part of whatever darkness had settled over this place. A part of the bridge. A part of the night. And then I saw it. The water beneath the bridge. It wasn't flowing like a normal river anymore. It was still. The surface was perfectly smooth, like glass, reflecting the dark sky above, but it wasn't right. It wasn't just a reflection of the night, it was as if the water was holding something, something that wasn't visible but was still there, waiting. The man's cold hands slowly moved from my shoulder, sliding down my arm like a snake, and I felt the chills seep into my skin. It burned, as if his touch was freezing me from the inside out. I wanted to scream, to pull away, but my voice was gone, my body immobile. "Come closer." The voice wasn't just in my ears anymore. It was in my mind, in my thoughts. It was everywhere, inside me, around me, urging me, pulling me toward the edge of the bridge. Toward the water. The space around me seemed to warp, like the world itself was bending to its will. The trees, the sky, even the air around me, they all began to twist, to contort, as if something was clawing at the edges of reality, trying to break through. The bridge creaked, its wood groaning under the weight of something ancient, something old, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. I glanced down at the water again. The glassy surface was now rippling, slowly, as if something beneath it was stirring. Something big. Something that had been slumbering for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And then, from the depths of the water, I saw it. A figure, barely visible, a shadow moving beneath the surface. It was huge, its form barely distinguishable, but I could feel its presence, pressing against me like a wall of cold, suffocating darkness. It was waiting for me, waiting to claim me, to drag me down into the abyss. Closer. The voice was growing louder, more insistent. "You're ready, come closer." I could feel my body moving, as if it was no longer mine to control. My feet shuffled forward, one step at a time, as if the bridge itself was guiding me, pulling me closer to the water, closer to whatever lay beneath the surface. And then, I saw it clearer now. A face. Not just a face, but dozens of them. Faces trapped under the water, staring up at me with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. The faces of people who had come before me, who had stood on this bridge and had been claimed by the darkness, dragged down into the depths. Their eyes followed me, pleading with me, begging me to stop, to turn away. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. I was so close now, so close to the edge. I could feel the cold water at my feet, feel its icy fingers reaching up, wanting to take me, to pull me under. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, suffocating me. The man behind me was silent now, watching with that grin that never seemed to fade, his eyes empty, empty as the faces below. I was about to fall. But just as I was about to step into the water, something broke through the fog of terror that had clouded my mind. A thought. A desperate, fleeting thought that fought against the darkness, against the pull. This isn't real. This is just a dream. I don't know where the thought came from, but it was enough. Enough to snap me out of the trance I had been in, enough to give me a final burst of strength. I pulled back. I jerked away from the edge of the bridge, stumbling backward, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at the man. His grin was gone now, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read, something between rage and hunger. But I didn't stop. I ran. I didn't care about the car. I didn't care about anything but escaping, getting away from the nightmare that had taken hold of me. My legs burned as I sprinted down the road, not looking back, not daring to look back. The darkness seemed to chase me, wrapping around me, following me with every step I took. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then, as I reached the point where the trees cleared and the road opened up ahead, I heard it. The voice. Not yet. We'll meet again. It was softer now, distant, but I could still hear it. And I knew, deep in my soul, that it wasn't over. That it would never be over. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My legs were sore, my chest tight from the cold night air and the terror that clung to me like a second skin. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself think about what had happened on the bridge. If I did, I knew it would consume me. I had to keep moving. Finally, I reached the car, my breath ragged and shaky as I fumbled with the door handle. I slammed it shut behind me, the engine roaring to life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought my knuckles might snap, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I had to leave this place, leave everything behind. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road was empty. The trees were still. But that voice, it was there again, in the back of my mind, whispering through the fog of my thoughts. Not yet. We'll meet again. I gasped, my pulse quickening. The words weren't just in my head anymore. They were everywhere. The hum was back, low and vibrating, like a heartbeat echoing through my bones. The darkness that had filled the bridge now seemed to follow me, creeping in at the edges of my vision, pressing on my chest. The car swerved as I fought to keep control, my eyes darting from the road to the trees that lined it. I couldn't look at the trees for too long. I could already see them shifting in my peripheral vision, their branches twisting like reaching fingers. Focus, I told myself. Just focus on the road. But the voice didn't stop. It filled the car now, so loud it felt like it was inside my head, in my very soul. You can't escape. You're already ours. I slammed my foot down on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped down the empty road. The car rattled, its headlights casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement, but the more I drove, the worse it got. The hum was growing louder, and I could feel my sanity starting to slip. It wasn't the road anymore. The world around me seemed to distort, the lines blurring. I looked at the trees again, and for a split second, I saw them. They weren't trees anymore. They were figures. Dark, faceless, tall shapes that watched me as I drove past. Their eyes burned with the same emptiness I had seen on the man's face. I screamed, swerving the car to the side, almost hitting a guardrail. My heart was pounding in my throat, my vision swimming. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. And then the voice came again, sharper, more insistent. Closer, come closer. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a stop. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I clutched the wheel, staring into the darkness. The road was gone. There was no more pavement beneath me. No more cars, no more guardrails, no more signs or landmarks. Just blackness, stretching infinitely in every direction. It was like I was floating in nothingness. I glanced around, the terror settling into my bones like ice. The world had collapsed. The trees were gone. The road was gone. There was nothing left but the darkness. I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the rearview mirror, where I saw it. The figure. It was behind me. The man. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were others. Dozens of them, standing in the distance, their pale faces gleaming in the reflection. They were watching me, waiting for me, and I knew, without a doubt, that they were the ones who had been following me. The ones who had haunted me on the bridge. And they were closing in. The voice filled the car again, louder, now impossible to ignore. Come closer, join us. The car shook, the engine sputtering as the ground beneath it seemed to shift, as if the world itself was bending to some unseen force. The dark figures were now at the edges of my vision, stretching closer with every passing second. I could feel them. I could feel their presence in the air, in my skin, in my mind. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back, to run, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong. The pull was too powerful. I turned the key, trying to start the car, but nothing happened. The engine refused to turn over, the lights flickering out. I was trapped. I was trapped in the dark, surrounded by them, with nowhere to go. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A low, guttural sound. It was a whisper at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder until it was almost a roar. The voice, no longer human, no longer soft, but something else. Something older. Something that had been waiting for this moment. Your time has come. I tried to open the door, to escape, but it was locked. My hands fumbled for the handle, but the air around me was growing thicker, heavier. The darkness was inside the car now, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as I thought I might lose all sense of reality, I heard something else. A crack. A sharp, terrible crack, like the sound of something breaking, something important shattering. The car jolted, the seat beneath me trembling as if something was tearing it apart. The figures outside the window were closing in. I could see their faces now, their eyes empty, hollow, hungry. I didn't have time to scream. The darkness enveloped me. The sound of the hum, the voices, the whispers, it all came together in a deafening crescendo, and then, nothing. I woke up to darkness. It wasn't the same darkness as before. It was thicker, suffocating, pressing in from all sides, as if the very air itself had weight. I tried to breathe, but the air was thick, thick as tar, and it felt like it was choking me, like it didn't want me to exist. My body was numb. I couldn't move at first, couldn't feel anything except the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I didn't know where I was. Was I still in the car? Was I still on the road? My eyes shot open, straining against the dark, but there was nothing to see. It was like I was floating, suspended in an endless void, with no up or down, no direction, nothing. But then, a sound. A whisper. Wake up. The voice. It was here again. I didn't know how, didn't know why, but I could feel it crawling inside me, wrapping itself around my thoughts, pulling me closer to it. The pull was irresistible, like gravity, drawing me down into the depths of something I couldn't see, something I didn't understand. Come closer. I tried to scream, tried to cry out, but my voice was gone. There was nothing left but the pulse of the voice in my head, the hum that had never truly stopped, now reverberating through my very bones. The air shifted. The darkness around me began to break, like cracks forming in a sheet of glass. At first, it was just a thin line, a sliver of light that sliced through the void. But then, it spread, tearing the darkness apart, revealing something I couldn't understand, something beyond comprehension. A face. At first, I thought it was mine. But then, I saw the eyes. They weren't mine. They were wide, hollow, staring back at me from some place deep inside the void. The face was pale, almost sickly, twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. It was like a reflection of myself. No, not a reflection. A mockery. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The eyes held me, locked me in place, paralyzed in this horrible dream. The lips, twisted in that same grotesque grin I had seen on the man's face, opened, and I heard the words that I feared more than anything. Welcome. The darkness expanded, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, sucked into it like a whirlpool. The sound of the hum grew louder, more insistent. The trees, the bridge, the water, they were gone now, replaced by this endless blackness that felt alive, that felt hungry. The face loomed closer, its eyes devouring me, and I realized, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that this wasn't a dream. This was real. I tried to fight it. I tried to move, to scream, to do anything to break free, but the more I struggled, the tighter the grip of the darkness became. It wrapped around me like chains, binding me, holding me in place. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they drowned out everything else. Come closer, you're ours now. I couldn't see. I couldn't think. All I could hear, all I could feel, was the hum, the pulse, the voices. And then, it was as if the world cracked open. Light. Blinding, searing light pierced through the darkness, tearing at it, ripping it apart. The faces around me screamed, their mouths wide open in silent agony. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend and twist, and I felt myself being torn from one place to another, not moving but being pulled through space, through time. I didn't know how long it lasted. I didn't know if it was seconds or hours. But when the light finally faded, when the screams faded into nothingness, I found myself back on the bridge. But it wasn't the same. The bridge was silent now. The trees, the water, the night, it was all still, all unchanged. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. The same hum that had filled my ears before was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. I looked around, expecting to see the man, expecting to feel the pull again, but there was nothing. Just the cold wind rustling through the trees, the distant sound of the river below. But I could feel it. The presence. The darkness. It was still here. It hadn't left. It was just waiting. Watching. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. I could feel it deep inside me, the terror, the darkness, the voices. It wasn't gone. It wasn't over. And then I heard it. The faintest whisper. Not yet. I spun around, but there was no one there. The bridge was empty. The road was empty. But I knew it would never end. The darkness had claimed me, and it wasn't letting go. Not ever. I was its now. Forever. And somewhere, in the distance, I could hear the faint hum again, growing louder. The cursed house in Connecticut. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. The house sat at the edge of a quiet town in Connecticut, far from the noise of city life. Old, but not ancient, it was charming in its own way. The type of house people dream of owning, with its peeling white paint, ivy creeping up the side, and an inviting front porch where you could sit and watch the world go by. It was exactly what we were looking for. I moved in with my wife, Emily, and our young daughter, Lily. The idea was simple: leave the chaos behind, find peace in this small town, and build a new life in a place that promised serenity. The house was affordable, even though we could tell it had been empty for a while. The previous owners had moved out, and no one had seemed to want it since. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was only after we had settled in that I started noticing strange things. At first, it was subtle, things out of place. A mug moved from the kitchen counter to the dining table, a drawer slightly ajar that I was sure I had closed. I convinced myself it was just the normal disarray of moving into a new home. Everyone forgets to put things back sometimes, right? But then the doors started to act strange. The front door, which had never given us trouble, started to creak and groan when we tried to close it. Sometimes it would slam shut by itself, making a loud, unnerving sound that echoed through the empty hallway. Emily thought I was overreacting, but I could sense something wasn't right. And Lily began to speak of things I couldn't explain. "Mommy, the lady in the mirror told me to play," she said one evening, her voice small and serious. Emily dismissed it as an imaginary friend, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a small thing, easy to overlook. Still, there was an unease in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. One night, after we had finished unpacking the last of the boxes, we decided to explore the house more thoroughly. Emily and Lily were in the living room, chatting and playing, while I decided to venture upstairs. The old floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved through the hallway. The rooms were large but sparse, the walls bare except for the occasional smudge from years of neglect. At the end of the hall, there was a door that led to a small, forgotten attic. I hadn't noticed it when we first moved in, but tonight it caught my attention. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to let me see the dark space beyond. I hesitated. I had heard rumors about old houses with hidden rooms, places where strange things happened. But I pushed the thought away. It was just an attic, nothing more. Probably full of dust, old furniture, or forgotten belongings. I reached for the door and pushed it open. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. A cold, damp air rushed at me from the darkness. The light from the hallway barely reached the far corners of the attic, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. It was as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I scanned the room, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Boxes piled up in one corner, some marked with faded labels. A rocking chair sat in the middle of the room, its seat still warm despite the cold air. There was a sense of abandonment here, of something long forgotten. And then I saw it. A small mirror, half covered with a dusty cloth, leaning against the wall. Something about it caught my eye. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a pull toward it. I moved toward the mirror, brushing off the dust with my hand. The reflection that met my eyes wasn't mine, not entirely. The mirror seemed to shimmer for a moment before showing me a distorted version of the room, the shadows darker, the rocking chair moving ever so slightly as though someone had just sat in it. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped back, suddenly uneasy. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Just a figment of my imagination. I turned to leave, but the door to the attic slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, hands shaking. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it remained shut. Panic gripped me. The air in the attic seemed to grow thicker, suffocating me. The shadows seemed to press closer, moving in ways they shouldn't. "Emily!" I shouted, banging on the door with my fists. "Lily!" But there was no answer. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breath and the creaking of the old house around me. The rocking chair, once still, now began to move again, gently rocking back and forth. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to explain what was happening. Something was wrong with this house. Something I couldn't understand. I pulled harder on the door, adrenaline flooding my system, but it still wouldn't open. And then I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible whisper coming from the darkness beyond the mirror. "Stay." The whisper lingered in the air like a chill, creeping under my skin. "Stay." It wasn't Emily or Lily. The voice wasn't human, or at least, not in the way I understood. It was cold, distant, yet somehow close, like it was right next to me, breathing down my neck. My heart hammered in my chest as I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear anything that might tell me where Emily and Lily were. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement. The house was eerily still, as if it were holding its breath. I took a step back from the door and looked around. The attic was growing colder, the shadows deepening. The small mirror still stood in the corner, its reflection distorted, flickering like a candle flame in the wind. My eyes kept drifting toward it, as though the mirror itself was calling to me, pulling me in. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to give in to whatever force was trying to drag me closer. But my legs moved on their own, as though they had a mind of their own. I tried to stop, tried to turn away, but it was as if the mirror had a hold on me. The rocking chair was moving again, this time faster, as if someone was sitting in it, gently rocking back and forth. The creaking sound grew louder, echoing through the attic, but there was no one there. I reached out a hand toward the mirror. The moment my fingers brushed against the cold glass, the world around me seemed to shift. The walls of the attic stretched, and the air thickened, as though I was being pulled into the reflection itself. The floor beneath my feet felt like it was shifting, warping. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. My heart was racing, and I couldn't think clearly. The air in the attic felt thick with an unnatural pressure, like a storm was building, but there was no wind, no rain, just the suffocating stillness. I spun around, desperate to escape, but the door was still locked. The shadows in the corners seemed to be closing in on me, growing larger with every second. I ran to the window, hoping to see something, anything, that could pull me back to reality. But all I saw was darkness, just an endless blackness that stretched beyond the glass, consuming everything. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened with every panicked inhale, and I felt as though I was suffocating. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. The rocking chair was still moving, the sound now a rhythmic thumping that was almost hypnotic. I turned toward it, my gaze fixed on the empty seat. There was something wrong with it, something unsettling, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I looked closer. The seat of the rocking chair was moving more violently now, as though someone was pushing against it from the inside. Then, I saw her. A figure, pale and translucent, appeared in the rocking chair. It was a woman, or at least, it looked like one. Her features were faint, barely discernible, but there was no mistaking the sense of dread that came from her presence. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine. I froze. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice like the wind rustling through dead leaves. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The woman's gaze was like a weight pressing down on me, paralyzing me in place. I blinked, and in that brief moment, she was gone. I gasped and spun around, my head whipping from side to side. The attic was empty. No woman, no rocking chair, nothing but the oppressive darkness. I bolted toward the door again, pulling with all my strength, but it remained stubbornly shut. Panic gripped me. I needed to get out, needed to find Emily and Lily. But where were they? The silence of the house was deafening. The air felt thick with tension, as though something terrible was lurking just beyond my reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. I forced myself to take slow, deliberate steps away from the door. There had to be another way out, another escape. I couldn't be trapped in this place forever. I moved toward the staircase, my feet dragging with every step. The house felt wrong, like it was alive and watching me. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the walls seemed to groan in protest. The oppressive weight of the house surrounded me, suffocating me. The door to the attic was still closed, but I could hear something now, scratching. Faint, at first, like claws scraping against wood. It grew louder, closer. I stopped, holding my breath, waiting. Then, suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing there. Just the air, thick and still, pressing down on me. Emily? Lily? My voice cracked as I called out, but there was no answer. I turned back toward the staircase, but the house felt different now. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the walls narrowing with every step. The shadows that had been there before now seemed to reach toward me, pulling me back. I had been here before. It was the same hallway, the same walls, the same door. But how? I had just come from the attic. I had been trying to escape. But no matter which door I opened, I ended up back here. Back in the same hallway. The walls were closing in, and the air was thick with something foul, something ancient. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, and I was left standing in the silence, trapped in this endless loop. The house wouldn't let me go. I couldn't breathe. The hallway stretched on forever, the walls narrowing like a vice, closing in around me. No matter which way I turned, no matter which door I opened, I always ended up back here, in this same cursed place. The house was shifting, warping, and I couldn't understand it. How could a simple house do this? How could a home, a place that was supposed to offer safety, trap me in its grasp? I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, exhausted, that the stress of moving had gotten to me. But every time I opened another door, every time I tried to leave, it was the same. The hallway remained unchanged, like a twisted reflection of itself. The shadows were growing longer, more pronounced. They pressed against the walls, expanding like dark tendrils, reaching for me. The air was thick with a suffocating sense of dread. I could almost feel the walls closing in on me, crushing me under the weight of something ancient and powerful. Emily! I screamed again, but the word felt hollow, lost in the oppressive silence. There was no answer, no sound but the echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. It was as if the house had swallowed her, consumed her whole, leaving nothing behind but emptiness. My legs felt like lead as I moved forward, each step dragging me deeper into the house's twisted maze. The doors seemed to multiply, each leading to another dark room, another hallway. But none of them were real. None of them were the way out. The whispering started again. It was soft at first, like a breath of wind, but soon it grew louder, more insistent. The words were unintelligible, a jumble of syllables that didn't make sense, yet they held a chilling power. I could feel them in my bones, in the very air around me, as if the house itself was speaking to me, urging me to stay. Stay, the voice hissed. I stumbled, my hands shaking, reaching for any surface to steady myself. But the walls were closing in faster now, the shadows pressing against me, suffocating me. My breath was ragged, desperate. I had to find Emily. I had to find Lily. I couldn't let them be trapped here too. I turned toward the door at the end of the hallway. It was different now, larger, darker. The handle seemed to beckon me, its presence undeniable, as if it were the only way out. But something stopped me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. I knew I couldn't open that door. Not yet. The floor beneath my feet groaned, shifting, as though the house was alive and moving beneath me. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, and I could hear the sound of something moving in the darkness, something that wasn't quite human. I turned back, but the hallway behind me was gone. The house had shifted again, rearranging itself. The door I had just passed was now behind me, and the staircase that had once led up to the attic was now a distant memory, swallowed by the house's endless maze. Emily! I cried, my voice shaking with fear. Lily! But there was no response. No footsteps, no voices. Only the whispering, the sound of something moving in the dark, always just out of reach. I could feel the walls pressing closer now, their cold, oppressive presence suffocating me. The air had become thick with a foul stench, something rotting, something ancient. The floor beneath me was slick with moisture, and the walls seemed to be bleeding, the stains creeping down like dark veins, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Stay, stay. I spun around again, looking for a way out, but the house seemed to mock me. The doors were all wrong. They led nowhere. I was trapped in a loop, a never-ending cycle of despair. I heard a sound. A door creaked open somewhere behind me. I froze. Emily? I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no answer. The door creaked again, and then I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the empty hallway. But there was something wrong about them. The steps were too heavy, too slow, like they were being dragged. I turned, but the hallway behind me was empty. There was no one there. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest, my body trembling with fear. The air felt thick with a presence I couldn't understand, something that wasn't human, something ancient and malevolent. It was watching me. And then I saw her. A shadow appeared at the far end of the hallway, a dark figure moving toward me. Her face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Stay, she whispered again. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the house had a hold on me, rooting me to the spot. The woman, if that's what she was, moved closer, her footsteps slow and deliberate. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The door at the end of the hallway opened again, and this time I saw Emily standing there. She looked different. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her face pale as death. "Come here," Emily said, her voice distant and cold. "Come inside." My blood ran cold. This wasn't Emily. This was something else, something wearing her face. "Emily!" I screamed, but it was too late. The door slammed shut, and the woman in the hallway stepped forward. She reached for me with long, gnarled fingers. I tried to back away, but I couldn't move. The shadows closed in on me, swallowing me whole. "Stay," she whispered, her breath cold against my skin. And then everything went dark. I woke with a start, my breath ragged, my chest tight as if I had been holding it for an eternity. My eyes shot open, but I was not in the hallway anymore. The familiar, oppressive air of the house was gone. I was in a small, dimly lit room, its walls lined with dusty, peeling wallpaper. The floor beneath me was cold, and my hands were pressed flat against the floor as if I had just fallen. I sat up quickly, my head spinning. My heart was still pounding, but I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. The last thing I remembered was the woman, no, not Emily, the other one, the one in the hallway. Her cold fingers, her voice, her presence that seemed to suffocate everything in its path. I tried to push myself up, but my legs felt weak. The room spun around me, and for a moment I thought I might collapse again. But I fought it, using the wall to steady myself. My eyes scanned the room, desperate to find something familiar. There was nothing. The room was bare, except for a small wooden table in the corner with an old oil lamp sitting on it. Its light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of dust and mildew, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I had to get out. I had to find Emily, and I had to find Lily. The house was trapping us, pulling us deeper into its web, and I was running out of time. I stumbled to my feet, my legs still unsteady. The room seemed to close in on me, the shadows twisting and warping around the edges of my vision. I could hear faint whispers, barely audible, like the wind rustling through trees, but these whispers weren't natural. They were wrong. I turned toward the door, but it was locked. The same as every door I had tried before. I pressed my palm against it, feeling the cool, solid wood beneath my hand. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. I stepped back, trying to think, trying to remember anything that might help me understand what was happening. The house had been shifting, changing, every time I tried to leave. But why? Why was it keeping me here? What did it want from me? I looked down at my hands, trembling as I rubbed them together. There were no answers, no explanations. Just confusion and fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized something. They weren't coming from outside the room. They were coming from inside me. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the voices, but they were everywhere. In my head, in my heart, in the air around me. They were urging me to stay, to accept what the house wanted, to surrender. I fought it. I couldn't give in. But the more I tried to resist, the harder it became. The shadows in the room grew darker, twisting and writhing like living things, reaching for me with clawed fingers. I could hear footsteps now, faint and distant, but growing louder with every passing second. Then I saw her again. The woman, the one who wasn't Emily. She was standing in the doorway, her face obscured by darkness, her eyes glowing faintly, like the eyes of a predator in the night. Her lips parted, and she whispered again, that same chilling word. Stay. The shadows around her seemed to grow, crawling across the floor, inching toward me. The air became thick with dread, suffocating, pressing down on me until I could hardly breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the room with her, with the house. Stay, and you will be safe, she whispered, her voice like a knife, cutting through the air. Stay, and everything will be over. I couldn't understand. I couldn't comprehend what she was saying. Why did she want me to stay? What was waiting for me if I did? Her eyes never left mine as she slowly stepped into the room, her feet making no sound as they touched the floor. She was moving toward me, her presence like a shadow, growing larger, more oppressive. My heart pounded in my chest. I had to get out. I forced my legs to move, my body screaming in protest. I turned toward the window, hoping to find something, anything, that might allow me to escape. But as I reached for the frame, I froze. The window wasn't a window anymore. It was a mirror. I looked into it, and for a moment, I saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. The figure staring back at me was a hollow shell, its eyes vacant and empty, its mouth open in a silent scream. The woman stepped closer, and her reflection appeared beside mine, standing in the mirror as if she had always been there, waiting. Leave now, the reflection of the woman said in my voice. I recoiled, stepping back from the mirror, but no matter where I moved, the reflection remained. My reflection, her reflection, the mirror, it was all the same now. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. And then I heard it. A sound so faint, so quiet, I almost missed it. A door creaked open behind me. I turned, and there she was. Emily. But she wasn't Emily anymore. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, and she stared at me with that same, hollow gaze. Come, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Come back. We're waiting for you. I backed away, my pulse racing. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But it felt real. The woman in the doorway smiled, a twisted, mocking smile. It wasn't a smile of comfort. It was the smile of someone who knew they had already won. And then everything went black. I woke again, but I wasn't sure I had ever truly fallen asleep. My surroundings felt wrong, familiar, yet twisted beyond recognition. The room was the same. The same damp, cold walls, the same flickering lamp in the corner. But now, there was an oppressive silence that suffocated everything. The whispers had stopped. The shadows had retreated. But something was different. I could feel it. I blinked several times, trying to shake off the heavy fog in my mind. I could still hear Emily's voice, that soft whisper in my head, calling me, urging me to return to her. Her words were a soft lullaby now, soothing, promising safety, promising release. It felt like a trap, but one that was so close, so inviting, it almost felt like peace. I stood up, my legs weak but functional. The floor creaked beneath my feet, a sound so unnervingly normal that it sent chills down my spine. I turned, searching for something, anything, that might give me a clue as to what was happening, what I had to do to escape. And then I saw it. A door. The door I had not seen before, standing at the far corner of the room, slightly ajar. The light from the lamp flickered on it, casting long shadows across its surface. It wasn't like the other doors in the house. This one was different. More real. My heart skipped a beat as I moved toward it, my hand shaking as I grasped the cold handle. For a moment, I hesitated. This was it, the final choice. On the other side of that door was either freedom or my demise. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. The house had already taken everything from me, my sense of time, my sanity, and, it seemed, Emily and Lily. I couldn't go back. But if I opened that door, there was no telling what I would find. I took a deep breath, gripping the handle tighter. The whispers began again, louder now, but still distant, like an ocean's current beneath the surface. Stay, you'll be safe. I slammed my hand against the door, pushing it open. A gust of cold air rushed past me, carrying with it the smell of rot, of decay. I stumbled back, but my feet were rooted to the floor as the door swung wide. On the other side of the threshold was nothing. Empty space. But in the center of that emptiness stood Emily, or the thing wearing her face. Her body was still, and yet her eyes followed me, not with recognition, but with hunger and emptiness that went far beyond death. Come to me, she whispered. You can still join us. It's not too late. The air grew heavier, colder. I felt the weight of her words pressing on my chest, suffocating me. Every part of me screamed to run, to find another way out, but my body refused to move. The house had broken me down, piece by piece, until I was nothing more than a puppet at its mercy. But then, just as I thought I would fall into the void, something inside me snapped. No. I couldn't. Not like this. I refused to be consumed by this house, to become a part of whatever it was turning everyone into. I wasn't ready to give up. I took a step forward, then another. The shadows around me twisted, reaching for my legs, but I pushed through them. Emily's hollow eyes stared at me, her lips curling into that mocking smile, but I didn't care anymore. The house could not take me. With one final surge of strength, I bolted past her, the darkness biting at my heels, the cold air clawing at my skin. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, but this time it felt different. There was a crack of light at the far end, flickering like a beacon. I ran toward it, my breath ragged, my legs burning. Every step felt like a battle against the house, against the shadows that still tugged at me, whispering my name. And then, just as I was about to reach the door, I heard a voice behind me. A faint whisper. You can never leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept running. The door ahead of me was open now, the light spilling out into the hallway like salvation. I pushed through. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was outside. I blinked, disoriented, my mind struggling to process the sudden change. The air was cool, the ground solid beneath my feet. I was standing in front of the house, the one I had been trapped in. The house stood silently in front of me, its windows dark, its doors closed. It looked normal. The same house I had walked into days ago. But it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. That something was still inside, waiting, watching. The house was silent now, but I could hear it in my mind, the whispers, the voices, the hunger. And I realized, with a chill that crawled up my spine, that I might have escaped the house, but the house had not escaped me. It was in my mind now. The door had opened, but I didn't truly leave. The mysterious island of Maine. There are places that should be left alone, places you don't speak about for fear of attracting attention, places that never quite make it onto a map. Maine is filled with these spots, forests too dense for most to explore, cliffs too steep to climb. But there's one place, a small, uncharted island, that only reveals itself under certain conditions. When the fog rolls in thick enough, and the sea is eerily still, it appears. I had heard the stories, rumors passed between fishermen and locals, whispered in the dark corners of bars. Some said it was a mirage, a trick of the mind. Others insisted it was real, though no one could ever explain why no one had stayed there long enough to tell the tale. The fog, they said, hid something far darker than a mere island. I had come to Maine to escape the bustle of city life, to find peace in the isolation of nature. I rented a small boat for the day, eager to explore the coastline and enjoy the serenity. It wasn't until I found myself out in the open water, far beyond the shoreline, that the fog began to roll in. Thick and unnatural, it swallowed the sea, leaving nothing but a suffocating white haze. At first, I thought little of it. The weather was unpredictable here, and I'd heard plenty of stories about the strange fogs that rolled in from the ocean. But as the mist thickened, my confidence waned. My boat, once bobbing freely on the water, now seemed trapped, the oars useless in the thick air. I stopped paddling, unsure of where I was. The coastline had disappeared, and I could no longer see the land. A deep unease settled in my chest. I should turn back, but the direction was no longer clear. Then, through the haze, I saw it. A shadow. A dark shape looming ahead of me. It was an island, small, rugged, and covered in dense trees that seemed to sway unnaturally despite the lack of wind. My heart raced. I didn't know if I was hallucinating or if the island had actually appeared from nowhere, but something about it called to me. The fog had completely closed in now, wrapping the boat in a thick cocoon. My hands gripped the oars tightly, and before I realized it, I had steered myself closer to the shore. And that's when I heard it, the sound of movement, something faint but undeniable. The rustling of leaves. The soft creak of branches. As if something, or someone, was watching me. I felt my skin prickle. I tried to ignore the growing feeling of dread and focused on the island. Maybe it was just the fog playing tricks on my mind. Maybe this wasn't such a strange place after all. I rowed the boat closer, and as I did, the shore began to come into focus. It was rocky, uneven, the kind of place you wouldn't want to set foot on without a clear reason. But the island seemed to call me, the need to explore becoming an overwhelming force in my chest. As I disembarked, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The moment I set foot on the island, the air grew colder. The fog thickened even more, nearly choking the air from my lungs. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears until you feel like you're suffocating. But the strange thing? The moment I stepped onto the island, the whispers began. It was soft at first, barely a sound. A breeze through the trees, a flutter of leaves. But as I walked deeper into the island, the whispers grew louder. And there was something wrong about them. They weren't voices, at least not human ones. They sounded like shadows, like a presence trying to make itself known without ever revealing itself. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the longer I walked, the more certain I became that I was not alone. There was something in those trees, something waiting, watching. The island, once quiet and still, now seemed to be alive with movement, creaking branches, shifting shadows, flickering glimpses of something hiding in the mist. I stopped and looked around, trying to make sense of it. The trees were unnaturally tall, the branches twisted in strange, unnatural patterns. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. The only response was the sound of leaves rustling and the soft creaking of branches. Something moved between the trees. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. Just the trees swaying in the wind that had suddenly picked up. I stood there for a moment, frozen. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back to the boat, to leave the island before whatever was watching me had a chance to reveal itself. But I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot. The whispers returned, more insistent this time, more demanding. And then, I saw them. Figures. Faint at first, like shadows creeping along the edges of my vision, but then they grew clearer. Tall, thin figures standing just outside the edge of the fog. Watching. My breath caught in my throat. They weren't human, but they looked too real. Their faces were blurred, as though they weren't quite there, as though they existed in the space between reality and something else. I stepped back, my hands shaking, my heart thudding in my chest. But no matter where I looked, I could still feel their eyes on me, a pressure on my soul. I didn't know how long I stood there, rooted in fear, before the first figure moved. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow either. Its movements were unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding just above the ground. I turned and ran. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in sharp, frantic bursts. The island had come alive, its trees bending toward me, the fog swirling around my feet like a physical presence, trying to slow me down. I didn't look back. I couldn't, but I could feel them. The figures were following me, their shapes moving just outside my vision. I reached the boat, my hands trembling as I untied it from the shore. The fog had thickened, and the figures were closer now, their presence suffocating. I threw myself into the boat, quickly paddling out into the open water. I didn't look back until the island was just a shadow in the distance. The fog began to recede. And as it did, the island disappeared. Just gone. But the terror it left behind stayed with me. I thought I had escaped. The island had vanished, and with it, the figures in the fog. The chill still clung to my bones, but the oppressive presence seemed to lift as the boat drifted further from the island's shore. My heart was still racing, each beat echoing in my ears, and yet I found it hard to breathe as the mist began to clear. The fog wasn't natural. It hadn't been like the fog I had seen before, thick and all-encompassing, but almost as if it was alive, as though it had a will of its own. Even now, as the last wisps of it dissipated over the water, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something had followed me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the island to reappear, but it didn't. It was gone. I tried to reason with myself. The island was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the light or the fog, perhaps. The figures, nothing but shadows in my mind. But the knot in my stomach refused to loosen, and the memory of those blank faces stayed with me, haunting me in the silence of the boat. I spent the rest of the day on the water, searching the coastline, but I never found anything like the island again. The fishermen I spoke to the next morning didn't know what I was talking about when I described it. They looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and pity, as though I had simply stumbled upon a bad idea after too many hours on the water. But there was something in their eyes, something I couldn't quite place, that made me feel as though they knew more than they were willing to share. That night, the dreams began. The fog, thick and cold, wrapped around me like a shroud. I stood on the island again, its twisted trees looming over me like dark sentinels. The figures were there, standing just beyond the fog, watching, always watching. But they were different now. Their shapes were clearer, their faces almost visible. They were twisted, deformed somehow, but it was their eyes that haunted me most. They were empty. Hollow. I tried to run, but the fog thickened, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I could hear the whispers again, like 1,000 voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The sound of feet brushing against the ground was growing closer, louder. And then, just as one of the figures reached out to touch me, I woke up, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. It was the same dream each night. The fog, the island, the figures. But this time, the whispers were clearer. They were calling my name. The next morning, I went back to the shoreline. I couldn't stop thinking about the island, about the feeling that I had left something behind. Something I couldn't quite grasp. I needed answers. The fog rolled in again that evening. This time, I wasn't going to wait for it to find me. I set out on the boat, my hands shaking with anticipation, or was it fear? I couldn't decide. The island was out there somewhere, hidden by the mist. It had to be. I needed to see it again, to confront whatever it was that haunted me. As the boat glided across the water, the fog swallowed me whole once more. But it didn't feel the same this time. The air was thicker, heavier, as if something was pressing in from all sides. The cold bit into my skin, and the oppressive silence returned, thicker than before. I strained my eyes through the mist, hoping for a glimpse of land. And then I saw it, the shadow of the island, looming ahead. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. The island was real. I steered the boat toward it, the mist swirling around me like it was alive. As I drew closer, I could hear the faint sound of rustling leaves, the same as before. The same haunting whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them, creeping into my thoughts. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The island had changed. The trees seemed taller, their branches more twisted, their bark darker. The ground felt wrong, as though it was alive beneath my feet, pulsing with an energy I couldn't understand. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, not my own. I spun around, my pulse racing. But there was nothing there. Just the fog, creeping in closer. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I could feel their eyes on me. The figures stepped forward, their forms emerging from the mist, their movements unnatural and stiff. They were closer now, their faces clearer, though still blurred, as though I couldn't quite see them in full. Their eyes were like black holes, empty and deep. They were watching me, waiting. One of them moved toward me, its steps slow but deliberate. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. The whispers surrounded me, their voices too many to count, too close to ignore. I could feel them pressing against my mind, pushing me towards something. The figure reached out, its hand cold and clammy. As it touched my arm, a shock of cold shot through my body, freezing me in place. I tried to pull away, but it was too late. The island, the mist, the figures, they were all closing in. And as I struggled, trying to break free, I realized something that made my stomach turn. The island wasn't just a place. It was a trap. I was never meant to leave. The grip on my arm was like ice. I could feel it seeping into my skin, spreading through my veins, numbing me. The figure that held me didn't speak, but its presence was deafening. I could hear its thoughts, no words, only the feeling of something ancient, something malevolent. The island had not just appeared in the fog, it had called to me, trapped me in its web. I tried to pull away, to free myself, but my legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the earth itself. I glanced around desperately, trying to find the shore, trying to see the boat, but the fog had swallowed everything. There was no way back. The whispers were louder now, all around me, not just from the figures, but from the trees, from the ground, from the very air. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their voices overlapping, building to a maddening crescendo. It felt like the island itself was speaking, urging me to stay, to listen, to join. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. Panic was rising in my chest, tightening around my throat. I needed to get away. I needed to leave. But as I turned to run, the fog parted for a moment, and I saw something that stopped me cold. The boat. My boat. It was floating, anchored just off the shore. But as I stepped toward it, I realized something horrible. The shore was farther away than before. I took a step, then another, and then another, but the distance didn't shrink. The boat was still there, but it seemed to be drifting further into the mist. I had only been standing there a moment, hadn't I? But the island was different now. The trees were no longer in the same positions, the rocks had shifted. It was as though the land itself was rearranging, bending to some unseen will. The figures had not moved, but their gaze never left me. They were watching, waiting. There was no escape. I realized with sickening clarity that the island was alive, shifting around me, trapping me in a never-ending loop. The fog was closing in again, and the air seemed heavier, suffocating. I spun back toward the center of the island, trying to force myself to think clearly. There had to be something, some way out. The figure holding my arm finally released me, stepping back into the mist. It was as though the fog itself had swallowed it whole, and the island once again seemed still, too still. That's why I saw it. A figure, not one of the twisted watchers, but something else. Something human. It stood by one of the trees, its silhouette barely visible in the mist. The figure was motionless, facing the ground, and for a moment I thought it was another trap. But something in its stance felt different, desperate. I stumbled toward it, my body trembling, every instinct telling me to turn and run, but my feet moved on their own. The closer I got, the clearer the figure became. I could see the ragged clothes, the mud-caked boots, the expression on the person's face. It was someone like me, someone who had come to this island only to be trapped in the same nightmare. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice a rasp, barely audible above the growing whispers that surrounded us. The fog closed in tighter, and the sound of footsteps. No, it wasn't footsteps. The sound was growing, a low, slithering hum that seemed to pulse in the earth beneath us. I reached out toward the figure, but as I did, it turned. And I saw its face. It wasn't a face at all. It was a hollow mask, just like the ones the figures had worn before. Blank, empty eyes, as though there was nothing inside. Just like the others. My blood ran cold. I staggered back, my mind trying to piece together what was happening. The island, it had swallowed someone else before me. Had they all come here, just like I did? One by one, they had tried to escape, and the island had taken them. The whispers were now deafening, the hum rising in pitch. I turned around, frantic, but the figures were coming closer. The fog pressed in around me, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I was being pulled into the island's heart. I broke into a run. It was the only instinct left, to escape, even though I knew it was useless. I wasn't running from the island anymore, I was running toward it. The land was shifting beneath me, the trees closing in, the figures surrounding me. They had no faces, no voices of their own. They were part of the island. The island was the prison. As I ran, I could feel the ground begin to shift beneath my feet, the soil moving, the trees bending to force me back. The fog swirled, and I could no longer see the path ahead. I heard the voices of the figures around me, but now they were joined by something else, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the distance. The island was mocking me, trapping me in a cycle. I stopped. I could no longer hear the figures. The whispers were gone. The fog was thinning, and for the briefest moment, I saw the ocean. The real ocean, beyond the island. It was distant, so distant. But I could see it. I reached forward, my body trembling. The moment I stepped forward, the fog rushed back in. The island wasn't going to let me go. I stood frozen, my heart racing. The brief glimpse of the open sea had felt like a promise, like a way out, but now it was slipping away. The fog thickened around me again, closing in like a tightening noose. I could feel the island's grip on me, an invisible force that seemed to pull at my very soul. I turned back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures were still there, watching from the shadows between the trees. The mist made them hard to see clearly, but I could feel their eyes, cold and empty, staring through me. Their silence was suffocating, pressing on my chest, as if they were waiting for something. Waiting for me to do something. The island had changed. The trees no longer looked like trees, the rocks were not where they had been. I had seen this place only moments ago, yet now it was utterly unfamiliar. I took a step back, then another, my mind racing. How had it happened? Had I just imagined the sea? Had it been some kind of trick, a cruel illusion to lure me deeper into this nightmare? I glanced down at my feet. The ground beneath me was soft, damp, like the earth was shifting with each step I took. It wasn't real. The realization struck me hard. The island, the fog, the figures, it was all part of the same twisted game. The boat, the shore, the fleeting image of the sea, it had all been a trick to keep me here, to keep me from leaving. Every step I took, every attempt to escape, only brought me back further into the island's grip. My body trembled as I sank to my knees, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. I wanted to scream, to rage against the island, but I knew it would do no good. No one would hear me. I was alone. Trapped. The whispers began again, softer now, like a lullaby sung from far away. I shook my head, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. I covered my ears, but it was useless. The voices were inside my head now, echoing in every corner of my mind. Stay with us. I forced my eyes shut, trying to block out the voice that had whispered those words. But as I did, a new sound cut through the fog, a sound like footsteps. It was distant at first, but then it grew louder, closer. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing. No one. Only the trees and the mist. The footsteps grew louder, almost a rhythm now, like a slow march. The sound echoed all around me, and I could feel the presence of something just beyond the mist, something watching me. I got to my feet, my body moving without thinking. My legs carried me forward, through the fog, toward the sound. I had to know what it was. Was it another trick? Or was it real? The fog seemed to part ahead of me, just enough to reveal a path. I followed it, my steps hesitant, unsure. Every breath I took felt like it could be my last. And then, as I turned a corner, I saw it. The figure. A tall, gaunt figure standing alone at the end of the path. The figure was turned away from me, its back to me. It wore a long coat, a dark hood hiding its face. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. I took a step closer, my heart thundering in my chest. It felt wrong, like stepping into the middle of a nightmare. But something pulled me forward, as if the island itself was guiding me to this figure, making me reach out. I was no longer in control. I took another step, and then another, until I was standing directly in front of the figure. It was so still, so unearthingly silent. And then it turned. The figure's face was like a mask, smooth and featureless, completely blank. There were no eyes, no mouth, just a pale, empty surface where a face should be. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. "Help me." The voice was not from the figure. It was from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The path I had been following was gone. The trees were no longer arranged as I had seen them before. Everything was wrong. A deep, bone-chilling laughter echoed from all around me, rising from the very earth beneath my feet. The fog swirled violently, as if the island itself was alive, mocking me. "You can't leave." The voice was everywhere now, coming from the trees, from the ground, from the very air. I could feel it, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I looked up at the sky, but it was darkening, the clouds swirling into unnatural shapes. There was no horizon, no escape. I took a step back, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to find a way out. But as I turned around, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I stumbled, my arms flailing, but there was nothing to grab onto. The earth opened up beneath me, and I fell. I didn't scream. I couldn't. There was no sound, just the sensation of falling, of being swallowed by the island. The mist rushed to meet me, closing in like a blanket. I hit the ground. Hard. For a moment, everything was dark. My head spun. My body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of the island itself. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the forest. I was back at the shore. The boat was there. My boat. I reached out, my hands trembling. The island was gone. But the fog was still there, still swirling around me. I sat up quickly, the rush of panic flooding my senses as I took in the sight of the shore. The fog clung to the beach like an unwanted guest, lingering in thick tendrils that wrapped around my legs. The boat was there, just as I had seen it before. It was the same boat, my boat, but something about it seemed different now. The wood was darker, the ropes frayed and twisted in a way that looked unnatural, like they had been left there for much longer than they should have. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. This was my chance. The island had vanished. The figures were gone. The trees, the fog, the strange whispers, they were all gone. But I wasn't fooled. Not anymore. I ran toward the boat, every step feeling like an eternity. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the edge of the water. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was distant, hollow. It was almost too quiet. I reached out for the boat, my hands trembling. But then, I stopped. The fog had begun to move again, swirling in on itself, rising like a living thing. It shifted in patterns, forming shapes that seemed to dance just beyond the corner of my vision. I looked around frantically, but there was no escape. The shore, the boat, everything, it was the same, yet different. A twisted reflection of what it should have been. I turned back to the boat and reached for the ropes, but as I touched them, they felt cold, almost lifeless. My hands slid along the ropes, but they wouldn't come loose. I pulled harder, desperation rising in my chest, but the boat wouldn't move. It was as if the island itself had rooted to the ground, anchoring it in place. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound rising from the depths of the fog. It was the sound of breathing, slow and deliberate, but not my own. Not human. I spun around, my pulse quickening. There, at the edge of the mist, a shape moved. A figure, taller than a man, cloaked in shadow. Its form shifted and distorted, as if it were made of the very fog that surrounded it. You cannot leave. The voice was clear now, sharp, like a blade cutting through the thick mist. It was deep, echoing in the pit of my stomach. My legs felt weak, my body trembling as I stumbled backward. You belong here. I shook my head, trying to make sense of the words, trying to break free from the suffocating grip of fear. I had to leave. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I knew deep down that it was. The island, the fog, the figures, they were all a part of something far older, far darker than anything I could comprehend. I tried to run, to flee, but as I turned toward the trees, I saw them again, the figures. They were standing at the edge of the forest, watching me, their eyes gleaming in the mist like cold, empty sockets. They were not human, I realized. Not fully. They were shadows, shapes that couldn't exist in the real world, and yet they were here, moving closer, inching toward me with every breath I took. My throat closed, a scream bubbling up but caught in my chest. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. I turned back to the boat, still frozen in place by some unseen force. I tried again, pulling at the ropes with all my strength, but it was useless. The boat refused to budge, as if mocking me, keeping me anchored in this nightmare. There is no escape. The voice came again, this time behind me. I spun around, and there it was, the figure. It loomed over me, a mass of swirling fog, its face a black void, a featureless mask. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me, crushing me. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, but I couldn't get away. There was nowhere to go. The island had closed in on me completely, trapping me in its endless loop of fog and shadows. You are part of the island now. The words rang in my ears, and suddenly, the world around me seemed to shift. The shore, the trees, the boat, they all blurred, becoming indistinct, merging into one. The fog thickened, swirling like a storm, and the figures stepped forward, their hollow eyes staring at me with cold intensity. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my body refused to move. It was as if the island had drained the life from me, leaving me a hollow shell, a puppet caught in its web. The figure in front of me reached out, its hand a massive mist, and I felt it wrap around my wrist. Cold. Freezing. Unyielding. Welcome home. And then, everything went dark. The ghost of the firefighter from Chicago. I never expected to find myself in the old part of Chicago, especially late at night. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt too still, as if the city itself was holding its breath. It was an area full of old buildings, narrow streets, and dark corners. They say there's history here, history that doesn't always stay buried. I was walking home after a late shift at the diner when I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but growing louder as I walked down the street. It sounded like someone calling for help. I paused, my steps slowing, trying to make sense of the sound. It came from the direction of an old building that had burned down years ago, the kind of place that had been abandoned since the fire. The remains of the structure stood like a skeleton against the night sky, charred and forgotten. Help, please, help me. The voice moaned. It was hoarse, weak, but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure why, but something told me not to go. Still, curiosity and a sense of duty pushed me forward. I approached the building cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air around me felt colder as I neared the old site, and the darkness seemed to deepen, pressing in from all sides. I looked around, half expecting to see someone in trouble, someone who needed help. But all I could see was the shell of the building, its broken windows staring blankly at me. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. Just the sound of the wind whispering through the ruins. I took a step forward, the ground crunching beneath my shoes as I moved closer to the fire-ravaged remains. My breath quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That's when I saw him. A figure, standing in the doorway of the burned building, barely visible in the shadows. He was dressed in old firefighter gear, worn and singed, but still intact. His face was obscured by a helmet, but I could see the outline of his posture. He was slumped, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. His movements were slow, as if he were barely able to stand. "Help me," he said again, his voice trembling with what I thought was fear or perhaps pain. Something about his voice felt wrong, though. It wasn't just the desperation. There was something unsettling, like a warning buried in the words. "Are you okay?" I called out, stepping closer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved forward, the figure slowly turned toward me. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, leaving only the faintest outline of his form. His head tilted slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes, something hollow, like he was begging for release. "Please, help me," he repeated, taking a step closer. I hesitated. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. But I couldn't leave someone in need. I took another step forward, and that's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the usual scent of smoke or ash that lingered around the site. It was something more pungent. Something like burnt flesh. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to stop. But it was too late. Before I could turn around, the figure lunged toward me, his arms reaching out with unnatural speed. And then, everything went black. I woke up in darkness. My head was throbbing and my body felt heavy, as though I had been lying there for hours. I groaned and tried to push myself up, but the air around me was thick, suffocating. The smell of smoke still lingered, but it wasn't just the faint scent from the ruins of the old building. It was closer, as if the air itself had absorbed the stench of the fire. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the lack of light, but all I could see was black. "Where am I?" I muttered, my voice hoarse, echoing in the oppressive silence. I could barely move. My arms felt like they were pinned to my sides, my legs heavy and uncooperative. Panic began to claw at me. What was happening? How had I ended up here? The last thing I remembered was the firefighter, the figure in the doorway. The burnt smell, his pleading voice. I had tried to help him. Hadn't I? Then, there was nothing. I took a shaky breath, attempting to calm myself. It didn't help. My heart raced as the silence around me deepened. I turned my head, straining my ears for any sound. A distant creak, like the groan of old wood settling. Then, the faintest whisper, like a breeze that carried words too soft to decipher. I strained to listen. "Help me." The voice. It was him again. The firefighter. But this time, it wasn't just his voice I could hear. There were others, whispers, low and haunting. They seemed to be coming from all around me, as though they were circling, closing in. I could feel the weight of their presence, the pressure of their unseen eyes. I wasn't alone. My mind raced. What was happening? Where was I? I tried to push myself up again, this time managing to get on my knees. The ground beneath me was uneven, cold, and damp. I didn't recognize the space. It wasn't the burned-out building anymore. It felt different. Faintly familiar, yet wrong. There was no light, no source of illumination, but somehow I could see just enough to know that I wasn't in the same place. The walls were rough and stone-like, jagged in places, as if this were some forgotten underground tunnel or cavern. I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment I moved, something would find me. I looked around, searching for an exit, but all I saw was more darkness. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer just the firefighter's voice. There were others too, voices that begged, that whispered in tones of fear, of despair. My throat tightened as I slowly rose to my feet. The air seemed to close in on me, suffocating. My head swam, and a dull ringing filled my ears. Suddenly, there was a sound in the distance, a thump, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. It echoed through the space, each step growing louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively backed away from the noise, my eyes darting around in a panic. I was about to turn and run when I saw it. A shadow, moving against the darkness, an indistinct figure. It was tall, its outline barely visible in the blackness, but its presence was undeniable. It wasn't human. Its form shifted, flickering in and out of view, like smoke or mist. And then I heard it. A voice. But this time, it wasn't coming from any one direction, it came from everywhere, surrounding me. "Help me, please, save me." The firefighter's voice. But it was different now. It was desperate. Almost pleading. The words were stretched out, distorted, like they were being dragged through time. It was a cry for help, but there was something dark and twisted in it. Something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. The figure began to take shape, its features becoming more distinct. The firefighter's gear, charred and damaged, appeared in front of me, only now it was too much. His face, beneath the helmet, was grotesque, burnt and twisted, with hollow eyes that stared through me. His mouth opened, but there were no words. Just a guttural moan that made my stomach churn. I froze. I knew I shouldn't approach. I knew I should run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The whispers, the sound of movement, the eerie, distorted voice, it all closed in on me, and I felt like I was suffocating. The firefighter reached out, his hands like burnt claws, fingers twitching toward me, beckoning. Please, help me. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but all I could do was stare as his hands grew closer, his body starting to move toward me in a jerky, unnatural manner. The air around us grew colder, the oppressive darkness thickening, wrapping itself around me. Please. His voice was softer now, more insistent. Help me, and you will join me. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I had to get out. I had to escape. With all the strength I could muster, I turned and bolted. I didn't look back. The pounding of my heart was deafening, my legs burning as I ran, but the darkness was consuming me. The ground beneath me felt uneven, as if I were running in circles. Each step I took felt like it was taking me deeper into some sort of abyss. The whispers followed me, now louder, as if they were laughing at my futile attempt to escape. The firefighter's voice had become a relentless echo. Help me, join me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. I could feel something behind me, a presence that wasn't quite human, but it was there, closer with each passing second. My footfalls grew heavier, more desperate. The sound of my own breathing seemed to drown out everything else. I tried to push myself faster, but my legs were leaden and my vision was beginning to blur. The shadows swirled around me, their movements too fast to track. Something was watching me. Something was following me. A cold wind whipped through the air, and for a moment, I felt an icy touch graze the back of my neck. I froze, my body trembling as I realized that something had changed. The air was no longer just suffocating, it had become alive. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that came from all directions. It wasn't just the firefighter anymore. There were more voices, distorted, angry, hungry. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, its shape barely visible in the thickening fog. It moved erratically, like a flickering shadow. I could make out the charred remains of a firefighter's uniform, the same one I had seen before. And then, the figure looked directly at me. I could see it clearly now. It was him. The firefighter. His face was even worse than before. His features were grotesque, melted and twisted from the heat of the flames that had taken his life. His eyes, blackened and hollow, bore into me with a look of anguish. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the terror that surged through me. Help me. The voice, if it could even be called that, came from his lips once again, but now it was more than a plea. It was a command. Join me. The words reverberated in my mind, and for a split second, I felt a strange pull toward him. It was a dark, unexplainable pull, like a magnet drawing me closer. I couldn't fight it. No. No, no, no. I screamed in my mind, trying to shake the feeling off. But then I heard it. the sound of movement. More footsteps. Others, moving toward me from the shadows, unseen yet unmistakable. The whispers grew louder, the growls intensifying. I wasn't alone anymore. The air around me was thick with the presence of something malevolent. I could feel their eyes on me, hear their breath, slow, steady, as if they were waiting for something. Waiting for me. I snapped back into reality. I had to get away. Now. I turned and bolted, my heart racing even faster than before. I didn't know where I was going. I couldn't see anything in front of me. The air was thick, like it was trying to suffocate me, but I couldn't stop. I had to move. I pushed forward, blindly, frantically, my breath coming in short gasps. I could hear the footsteps behind me, closer now, growing louder. I had to find an exit. Something, anything, to escape this nightmare. As I stumbled forward, my foot caught on something. I fell hard, landing on my hands and knees. The cold, rough stone scraped my palms, but I didn't have time to feel the pain. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest as the sounds around me grew closer, louder. And then, I saw it. A faint light in the distance. It was weak, flickering, but it was something, anything, that could lead me to freedom. I ran toward it, the ground trembling beneath my feet, the whispers echoing in my ears. The footsteps behind me quickened, matching my pace, but I didn't dare look back. I'm almost there. Just a little longer. The light grew brighter as I pushed forward, and just as I reached it, I felt the air shift. A cold hand brushed my shoulder. I froze. No. I turned slowly, the breath caught in my throat. The firefighter stood there, right in front of me, his face twisted in agony. His black, hollow eyes locked onto mine. The darkness around us seemed to close in, the light disappearing as if it had never existed. His hand reached out toward me, fingers trembling, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as though his touch was pulling at something deep inside me. "Help me," he whispered. I had no choice. My legs were no longer moving. His presence was suffocating, drawing me into the void. His grip tightened, and the darkness closed in around me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been moments or hours. Time lost its meaning in the suffocating darkness. The first thing I remember is the feeling of cold metal beneath my fingers, rough and unyielding. Slowly, I opened my eyes, but all I saw was blackness. The darkness wasn't the same as before. It felt deeper, heavier, almost suffocating. Panic surged through me. I'm still here. I was still in the place I had tried to escape, the place where the whispers and footsteps followed me. But it felt different now, more oppressive. I was trapped in this black void with no way out. I struggled to sit up, my body stiff and sore. My surroundings were unfamiliar, but there was something that felt chillingly familiar about the silence. Then, I heard it, the low crackling sound, like a fire burning somewhere in the distance. "Help me," the voice. It was him. The firefighter. His voice was now just a faint whisper in the overwhelming silence, but it still sent chills down my spine. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel his presence, the cold, empty feeling that came with it. And then I realized I wasn't alone. The air around me seemed to shift, moving in unnatural waves. I could feel something close by, something watching. Was it him? Or was it something worse? "Get up." My brain screamed at me. I couldn't just sit here, waiting to be consumed by the dark. But as I tried to move, my legs felt heavy, as if they were anchored to the ground. I could barely lift them, the effort making me lightheaded. I managed to rise to my feet, staggering at first as I tried to adjust to the pressure in the air. The crackling sound grew louder, and I could make out the faint outline of something, a figure, standing just ahead of me. My heart skipped a beat. It was him. He was standing there, no more than a few feet away. His form was hazy, distorted by the darkness, but his firefighter uniform was unmistakable. His face, once grotesque and burned, now looked different. More human. But his eyes, those hollow, black eyes, were still the same. And they were locked onto me, unblinking. "Join me," the words came again, hoarse and strained, but they were louder this time. His voice felt like it was inside my skull, pulling at my thoughts. I took a step back, my mind racing. There was no way out. No escape. "Please," his voice grew more desperate, more pleading. "You must help me." I knew, deep down, that there was no helping him. He was beyond help. He had died in that fire, and now he was trapped, like a soul cursed to wander in the void, forever searching for someone to pull him out. But the longer I stood there, the more I began to question my own sanity. His words, his pleading, they were getting to me. The idea of being trapped here with him, of having nothing left but this dark, endless place. It was breaking me. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. No. I won't become like him. I forced my legs to move, dragging myself away from him. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly before me, but I had no choice but to keep moving. The silence was deafening. The crackling fire had vanished, and the whispers had faded into a quiet, suffocating hum. But then, just as I thought I had escaped him, there was a sound. A single step. And another. It wasn't my footsteps. I froze. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence moving toward me. No. No, no, no. The footsteps came closer, and suddenly there was a flicker of light. The faintest glow in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to guide me. I ran toward it, pushing myself forward, forcing my legs to move despite the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. The darkness seemed to close in with each step I took. The footsteps behind me were louder now, growing faster, and the air grew colder. Just a little farther. The light flickered again. It was almost blinding now, a pale, sickly glow that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I reached for it, my heart hammering in my chest. But then, just before I touched it, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into the abyss, the light vanishing above me. There was no ground, no walls, no air. Only darkness. And then, the whispers returned, louder than before. They filled my ears, my mind, drowning out everything else. And through the static of my thoughts, I heard his voice once again. "Help me. Help me." And this time, I knew. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. The darkness was suffocating. My breath was shallow, panic clawing at my chest as I tumbled through the black void. I couldn't see anything, couldn't feel anything except the raw terror pulsing through my veins. The weight of the air, thick and stifling, pressed down on me from all sides. And then, in the deepest part of that darkness, there was light. It was small at first, just a flicker, a dull glow, but it was enough. enough to draw me toward it, enough to make me believe, just for a second, that there might be an escape. I reached out, my hands trembling. I could feel the ground now, solid beneath my feet, though the light was still too far to touch. But as I moved forward, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They weren't just in my ears anymore, they were in my head, thrumming in my mind like a relentless drumbeat. "Help me!" I gasped, my eyes darting around, but all I saw was the glow. It was the only thing that remained constant in this endless void. And then, from the edges of my vision, I saw him again. The firefighter. His figure was clearer now, standing in the middle of the light, his face twisted in anguish. His eyes, those black, hollow eyes, locked onto me with an intensity that froze me in my tracks. "You're the only one left," his voice boomed, a strange, echoing sound that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "Come to me. It's the only way." I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but my legs refused to obey. I stood there, frozen, as the firefighter slowly stepped closer, his form shifting in the light like smoke, his burnt and scarred skin glistening with a sickly, unnatural glow. "You can't leave," he said, his voice now a whisper. "Not anymore." The words sent a shiver through me. I understood then. The ghost wasn't pleading for help. He wasn't lost. He was dragging me into his torment, pulling me into his eternal suffering. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The light, the one I had thought would save me, was a trap, just as everything else had been. The whispers, the steps, the firefighter's voice. They were all part of the same nightmare, a web that had already ensnared me, and now it was too late to escape. "No, please," I thought, but my body refused to move. The closer he came, the more suffocating the air became. It was as if the light, once a beacon of hope, was now turning into the very thing that would devour me. And then, without warning, the ground shifted beneath me, the solid earth crumbling away into nothingness. I fell again, but this time there was no abyss to catch me. There was no darkness. There was fire. Flames leaped up from the ground, engulfing everything around me. The heat was unbearable, but it wasn't the heat of a natural fire. It was something unnatural, something wrong. The flames didn't burn, they suffocated, wrapping around me like tendrils, pulling me into their center. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I could hear the crackling of the flames, the suffocating heat, but it was as if my body no longer functioned. I felt myself becoming lighter, my limbs growing numb. The firefighter's voice echoed in my ears one final time. "You are mine now." And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went dark again. The fire was gone. The whispers were gone. The light was gone. But so was I. There was nothing left. No body. No mind. Only the eternal darkness, and the knowledge that I, too, had become part of the fire, part of the endless curse. A ghost trapped in the same hell as the firefighter. A ghost with nowhere left to go. The Legend of the Fireballs in Texas. It was a quiet evening in the Texas countryside. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the vast, empty fields. I was driving home after a long day of work, the road stretching out before me like an endless ribbon of asphalt. The radio buzzed softly in the background, filling the silence with static as I made my way down the familiar path. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, a subtle shift that I couldn't quite place. The world around me seemed to have grown stiller, more suffocating. The cicadas had fallen silent, and even the breeze had died down to a stillness that felt unnatural. I slowed the truck, my eyes scanning the road and the fields on either side. That's when I saw it. A flicker of light, nothing too bright, just a small, orange glow that danced in the distance over the fields. At first, I thought it was just the light playing tricks, the last remnants of sunset reflecting off a distant object. But no! It was something else. Something that moved. I pulled over, curiosity pulling me toward the mysterious glow. The field stretched out before me, a sea of tall grass swaying gently, though there was no wind. As I stepped out of the truck, the ground beneath my boots felt too cold for a warm Texas evening. The glow grew brighter, and I could now make out a shape, a ball of fire, no larger than a soccer ball, floating just above the ground. It seemed to pulse with life, flickering like a candle in the wind, though there was no breeze. I stared at it for a moment, wondering what it could be. A campfire, perhaps? But why would anyone be out here so late, in the middle of nowhere? I took a cautious step forward, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The light flickered again, moving a few feet away from me, as if inviting me to follow. It was mesmerizing, no longer just a ball of fire, but something more, something alive. The more I stared, the more I felt drawn to it. My feet moved before my mind could even catch up, and before I knew it, I was walking across the field, my boots crunching on the dry earth. I was almost there, just a few steps away from the glowing sphere, when something caught my eye. The light had shifted, and now I could see what lay beneath it. Faces. They weren't clear at first, just vague shapes that seemed to melt and shift, but they were there. Horrible, contorted faces, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths twisted in silent screams. I froze. What was this? My heart pounded in my chest. I should have turned back then, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The faces in the fire seemed to be reaching out, pulling me closer, their gazes filled with a desperate, silent plea. I took another step forward, my breath catching in my throat. The temperature had dropped sharply, as though I had walked into an icebox. The warm Texas air had vanished, replaced by a biting cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I shivered uncontrollably, but my feet kept moving. It was as if the fire had some power over me, some unseen force that held me in place. Then, without warning, the fireball surged forward, darting like a comet toward me. I stumbled back, but it was too late. The flames were upon me. They didn't burn, but the cold intensified, wrapping around me like icy tendrils. I gasped, my hands reaching out, trying to push the fire away, but it didn't work. And then, for a split second, everything stopped. The fireball was gone, leaving nothing but the darkening field around me. The faces had vanished, but the cold still clung to me, as though they had left their mark on my very soul. The air had returned to its normal warmth, but the sense of dread lingered. I turned and ran back to the truck, my heart racing, the echo of the faces haunting my thoughts. As I started the engine and drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the fireball following me. But there was nothing. Only the vast emptiness of the Texas night stretching out behind me. I should have forgotten it. I should have convinced myself it was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination, maybe brought on by fatigue. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something watching me, waiting for me to return. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the cold that had seeped into my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. And that was just the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. The memory of the fireball, the faces, and that unearthly cold haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces, eyes wide in terror, mouths open as though they were screaming. But no sound. Just the overwhelming silence, like a vacuum that threatened to swallow me whole. By morning, the sunlight did nothing to erase the chill that clung to me. I could still feel the cold, deep in my bones, as though it had seeped into my very core. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just a bad dream, or maybe some strange natural phenomenon I didn't understand. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had to go back. I couldn't explain why, but the need to return to that field, to find some answer to what I had seen, gnawed at me. So, I drove back that afternoon, this time with a flashlight and a camera, hoping to catch some evidence that could explain what happened. The drive was uneventful, the road stretching endlessly beneath the hot Texas sun. The fields were as quiet and still as ever. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. But as I reached the spot where I had seen the fireball the night before, the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the air. But then it deepened, and soon I could see my breath puffing out in small, misty clouds. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I knew this feeling. It was the same cold I had felt the night before. It was here again, creeping in, just as it had when the fireball appeared. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of dry grass and something else, a faint, metallic scent that I couldn't place. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but I pressed forward, my feet dragging me closer to the center of the field. The shadows grew longer, more menacing as the sun dipped lower in the sky. And then, just like the night before, I saw it. A flicker of light, distant at first, but growing brighter, more intense as it floated toward me. It was no ordinary light. It was the fireball again, and this time it was larger, brighter, more aggressive. I could feel its heat even from this distance, but the air around me remained frigid. My breath formed visible clouds, while the fireball burned with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. I should have run. I should have turned around and never looked back. But again, I found myself moving toward it, as though it was calling me, pulling me closer, despite every logical bone in my body screaming to stay away. As I drew nearer, the air grew colder. The fireball hovered in the air, its light dancing like flames on the verge of flickering out. And then, I saw them. The faces. They were clearer now, more defined. I could make out features, haunted, contorted faces, their eyes wide with an expression of horror. But these faces were different. They weren't just frozen in fear. They seemed aware. They were looking at me, as if they recognized me. I felt my heart race, my legs heavy, unwilling to move. The faces in the fire seemed to reach out, their hands, no, their fingers stretching toward me from the flames, desperate, pleading. And in that moment, I understood. They weren't just faces. They were people, souls trapped in this fire, doomed to wander forever, never finding peace. And they were asking for help. I took a step back, my mind reeling. What could I do? What was happening? The cold was unbearable now, the air so frigid that it felt like the flesh on my bones was freezing solid. Suddenly, I heard a noise, crunching, like boots on dry ground. I turned, expecting to see someone, anyone, walking toward me. But there was no one there. Just the sound, growing louder, closer. And then, nothing. The silence returned, thicker, more oppressive than ever. I spun back around to face the fireball. The faces were gone, but the fireball still burned bright, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. It hovered before me, almost as if it was waiting for me to do something. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I felt it. A hand, icy cold, gripping my shoulder from behind. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. The air was empty. The silence pressed in from all sides. The fireball was gone. The faces were gone. But the cold remained. I ran back to my truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, the field growing smaller in my rearview mirror. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Something that had seen me. Something that would never let me go. And I knew, deep down, that the fireballs were far from finished. They were waiting for me. They were always waiting. The next few days blurred into one. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that I was being hunted by forces I couldn't comprehend. I had nightmares, endless dreams of fireballs, of faces and flames, of that terrible cold. The faces, the hollow expressions of desperation, were burned into my memory. I tried to return to normal life. I went to work, saw friends, even laughed, but it was all an act. The moment I was alone, the weight of the events crept back in. The cold never left. I told myself I was being irrational. There had to be an explanation. Some natural phenomenon, some odd weather pattern I didn't understand. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. The fireball, the faces, the cold, they were connected, and they were reaching for me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back. But this time, I wasn't going alone. I told my friend, Kyle, about what had happened. He thought I was crazy at first, but I insisted. He could tell I was serious. He didn't fully believe, but the terror in my voice convinced him to come along. He joked about getting a good story out of it, but I knew he had his doubts. We drove out that afternoon, the sun already dipping below the horizon. The road stretched endlessly before us, the landscape a familiar blur of dry brush and fields, but tonight it felt different. The air seemed thicker, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Kyle asked me again what we were looking for. I gave him a vague answer, but the truth was, I didn't know what I was looking for anymore. I just knew I had to face whatever this was, even if it meant facing the very thing that had nearly broken me. We reached the spot as darkness fell, the field stretching before us in an eerie quiet. Kyle turned to me, his face a mask of skepticism. So, where exactly did this fireball show up? I pointed to the area where I had seen it before. Right here. Kyle looked around. The field was vast, barren, with only the wind for company. It seemed harmless. But I knew better. We got out of the truck, and immediately, I felt it. The cold. It was subtle at first, like the last remnants of an autumn breeze, but it was there, creeping in, just as it had before. Are you sure about this? Kyle asked, his voice tense. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The fear in my chest was too strong. But it was also a strange kind of pull, an urge to get closer, to understand. We walked further into the field, my footsteps heavy in the growing darkness. The wind howled around us, carrying that same metallic scent I had smelled before. The air felt wrong, unnatural, as if something was waiting. watching. Then, without warning, it appeared. A flicker of light, faint at first, but quickly growing brighter. The fireball. It hovered just ahead, floating in midair, like a beacon. Kyle stepped back. What the hell is that? I froze. The light was the same as before, fiery, intense, but it cast no warmth. The cold had deepened, biting into my skin, gnawing at my bones. The fireball pulsed, and with it, the faces appeared once more. Kyle gasped. Jesus Christ, are those faces? I nodded, my voice failing me. The faces weren't just in the flames, they were part of them. Their eyes locked onto me, their mouths moved, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. The soundless screams were almost worse than any words could be. Kyle stepped forward, his curiosity overcoming his fear. We have to help them, he said, his voice trembling. Maybe they're trapped. No! I shouted, grabbing his arm. Don't go near it. You don't understand. But Kyle pulled away. He was determined, or maybe just too afraid to stop. The fireball seemed to beckon him, the faces within it pleading. Without thinking, I reached for him, but before I could get close enough, something happened. The ground beneath us shifted. The wind howled louder, and the temperature plummeted further. It felt like the earth itself was breathing, a deep, suffocating inhale that left me dizzy. The fireball flared, growing larger and brighter, and the faces, those horrible, twisted faces, seemed to grow more desperate, reaching out, calling to Kyle. Suddenly, Kyle stopped, his eyes wide with terror. What the hell? I can't move. He was rooted to the spot, staring at the fireball. His face twisted in fear, his mouth open as if to scream, but no sound came. I tried to pull him away, but my hand passed right through his arm. He was fading. The faces in the fireball screamed silently, their hands outstretched toward him. He began to disappear, his body losing its form, fading into the darkness. I reached out, but it was too late. Kyle was gone. The fireball, the faces, the cold, they were all I could see. The cold reached inside me, freezing my very soul. I turned and ran, not knowing if my legs would hold me, but I couldn't stop. I drove home that night, alone. The fireballs were still out there, waiting. They always would be. And now, I knew I couldn't outrun them. They were watching. Always watching. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kyle's face, his wide, terror-stricken eyes as he faded into the fireball. I saw those hands reaching for him, desperate, hungry. The cold still lingered inside me, like a frost that wouldn't thaw, even in the warmth of my apartment. The next morning, I was a shell of myself. I told myself it was just a nightmare, that maybe Kyle had somehow disappeared for another reason. But the truth was there, etched in my mind like a scar I couldn't erase. The fireball, the faces, the cold. They weren't just a freak occurrence. They were a warning. A warning I didn't understand yet. I tried to go about my day, work, errands, anything to keep my mind busy. But it was like the world around me was muted, distant. People's faces seemed foggy, their voices hollow. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I drove out to the field again. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want anyone else to get caught in this. I was afraid of what I might find, but I couldn't stop myself. Something inside me, deep down, told me I had to know what happened to Kyle, and why this was happening. As I approached the field, the air felt wrong once more. The wind was colder than usual, biting through my jacket as if it were made of paper. The trees seemed to bend unnaturally, their limbs twisted in strange, impossible angles. I parked the truck and stepped out into the silence. It was an oppressive kind of quiet, the kind that wraps itself around you, suffocating you with its weight. I walked into the field, my footsteps crunching softly against the dry earth. The further I went, the heavier the air became, until it felt like I was dragging myself through a thick, viscous fog. And then, there it was. The fireball, rising from the center of the field like a beacon in the dark. It hovered in the same spot where Kyle had vanished, and as soon as I saw it, I felt the cold grip of fear twist in my gut. The fireball pulsed, brighter than before, and then, there it was again, those faces, their hollow eyes staring into me, accusing. One face, the face of a man, seemed to flicker more clearly than the others, and I froze. It wasn't just any face, it was Kyle's. "No," I whispered, taking a step backward. No, this can't be happening." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The fireball seemed to pull me toward it, its warmth just an illusion. The cold, biting chill wrapped tighter around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. The face of Kyle twisted, the expression now something more horrific, something dark, almost alien. His mouth opened, but the sound didn't reach me. Only a chilling, unearthly wind swept through the field. The faces began to move, to shift, as though they were alive, like shadows trapped within the flames. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Every instinct I had told me to get away, but it was too late. The fireball flared and suddenly, I could hear it, a voice, low and garbled, whispering from the flames. "You can't escape," it hissed, the sound like ice cracking. I felt it then, the grip of something unseen, something ancient, reaching out from the fireball and latching onto my soul. The cold seared through me, colder than anything I ever felt, freezing my bones, my thoughts, my very will. The voice came again, louder this time, and though I couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. I was going to join them. The faces, the lost souls trapped within the flames, were calling me. And then, through the fog of fear, I understood. They weren't just victims of the fireball, they were its prisoners, bound to it for eternity. And now, I was about to join them. "No," I gasped, struggling to break free, but it was no use. The cold was suffocating me, pulling me deeper into the fireball's grasp. I was standing in the flames now, the fire swirling around me, but it didn't burn. Instead, it felt like it was consuming me from the inside out, freezing me, suffocating me, until all I could feel was the weight of their cold hands reaching for me. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. I woke up. I was lying in the field, my face pressed against the earth, gasping for air. The fireball was gone. The faces were gone. But the cold remained. I stumbled to my feet, shaking, my body weak from the terror. I looked around, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But deep inside, I knew the truth. The fireballs were real. They were still out there, and they were waiting for me to return. I didn't know how to escape them, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them win. I had to survive. I could feel it. The cold. It had settled deep into my bones, a constant, creeping presence that I couldn't shake. Even in the warmth of my truck, as I sped away from the field, the chill clung to me like a second skin. Every time I blinked, I saw Kyle's face, or worse, his shadow, flickering at the edge of my vision, following me. But it wasn't just Kyle. It was all of them. The faces, the voices, the souls trapped within those cursed flames. I couldn't escape them. They were haunting me, feeding off my fear. The more I tried to run, the more they pulled me back in, dragging me toward the field like a moth to the flame. I didn't know what had happened to Kyle or the others who had disappeared in the past. But I was starting to understand. This wasn't just a random phenomenon. It was something older, something darker, and it had been waiting for someone like me. Someone who had come too close to the truth. I had to go back. But I couldn't do it alone. I couldn't risk anyone else getting caught in this nightmare. So, I did what any sane person would do. I told no one. I didn't want anyone to follow me. The fireballs were mine to face now. I had no idea if I would survive, but I couldn't let their fate be anyone else's. That night, I returned to the field. This time, the air was thicker, heavier. The wind whispered through the trees, but it wasn't the comforting rustle of leaves. It was something else, something sinister. My footsteps crunched against the ground, but the sound felt distant, like it came from somewhere far away. I didn't see the fireball at first. The darkness was thick, as if it were alive, wrapping itself around me. I stood there, frozen, trying to steady my breath. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. I had to see this through. I had to know the truth. Then, just like before, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. It started as a flicker, barely noticeable, but it grew brighter, bigger, until it hovered in front of me, casting an eerie light over the barren field. The fireball. But it wasn't the same as before. This time, the faces weren't just visible, they were clear. They were watching me, waiting. And then, one of them moved. Kyle's face, his terrified eyes, stared at me from within the flames. But this time, he wasn't frozen in fear. His mouth opened, and I could hear the words, faint but unmistakable. "Help me." I stumbled back, a chill seizing my spine. My breath hitched, and for a second, I almost stepped toward him. But I didn't. Something deep inside me knew that if I moved closer, I wouldn't be coming back. None of us would. But it was too late. The fireball flared, its heat turning to ice, and the cold gripped me harder than ever. The faces began to move, and I realized they weren't just faces anymore. They were more than that. They were reaching out, not with their hands, but with their very souls, trying to drag me into the flames. The chill grew unbearable, seeping into my very thoughts, freezing everything I was. And then, Kyle's voice. Clearer now. Louder. "You can't escape. You never will." I tried to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The cold spread, enveloping me, pulling me closer to the fire. The more I struggled, the tighter the grip became. I could feel my skin grow numb, my body failing me as the darkness closed in. But there was a moment, just one moment, where I saw a sliver of hope. A small, flickering light in the distance. Not the fireball. Something else. A figure, moving quickly through the trees, heading toward me. It was a person. I didn't know who. But they were running toward the fire, toward the faces. "Help me!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. The figure didn't stop. They just kept running toward the flames. I tried to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't warn them. I couldn't save them. I could barely save myself. Then, the fireball erupted. The world went white, and the faces screamed, their voices combining into a deafening roar. I felt myself being pulled into the light, my body no longer my own. The cold reached into my chest, and the darkness consumed everything. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, there was nothing. I woke up. But it wasn't the same. The air was thick, heavy, and the ground beneath me felt like it was moving. The fireball was gone, but the faces were still here. I could feel them, just beyond my reach, pulling me deeper into the void. The last thing I heard before everything went black was Kyle's voice, whispering in my ear, "You're one of us now." And I knew, deep down, that I was never going to leave this place. I was never going to escape the fire. The Field of Fear in Oklahoma. Have you ever heard of the strange field outside of Guthrie? It's the kind of place that locals avoid, even though it's just a few miles from the main highway. They say that something about it isn't right, something that the land holds in its silence. I didn't believe in that stuff, ghost stories, curses, or whatever else people whispered about, until I saw it with my own eyes. I had just moved to Oklahoma for a new job, looking for a fresh start. The open skies, endless fields, and the quiet were all a welcome change from the noise of the city. But it didn't take long before I started hearing the rumors. Some said the field had been abandoned for years, while others claimed it was a site of strange, unexplainable occurrences. It was on my third week there that I saw it for myself. I had decided to take a walk one afternoon, looking for some peace away from the endless work. As I wandered farther from the town, I noticed a wide, flat field stretching out in front of me. The grass was tall, almost reaching my knees, and the air had a strangely thick feeling to it, as though something was just beneath the surface. At first, I thought I saw shapes among the plants, figures standing in stillness. They were so distant, so faint, that I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then I blinked, and they were still there. I couldn't make out any details, but they were definitely there. 4 of them. 4 dark, unmoving silhouettes. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just someone's idea of a prank, or maybe just some trees far off in the distance. But then, I felt it, a sudden chill in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The temperature dropped, and the wind, which had been calm, picked up. I could hear the grass rustling around me, but it sounded different. Like the ground itself was shifting. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was nothing. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The figures were closer. Much closer. And they hadn't moved. They hadn't taken a step, but now they were no longer distant shapes. They were near enough that I could almost make out their outlines. My heart started to race, and a deep, uneasy feeling crawled up my spine. I didn't stay to investigate. My feet moved of their own accord, pushing me faster toward the edge of the field. But as I glanced back one last time, I saw something that froze me in place. One of the figures had moved. Just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make my heart pound louder in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. That night, I couldn't shake the image of those figures from my mind. I told myself they were just an illusion, something the mind conjures up in isolation. Maybe they were just scarecrows, or people out hunting in the tall grass. But something deep inside me told me that was too simple an explanation. There was something more to it. something I couldn't quite understand. I should have let it go. I should have stayed away from the field. But I couldn't. Tomorrow, I would go back. I couldn't shake the memory of the figures standing motionless in the field. The image of them lingered as if somehow they were calling me back. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to go back. Something deep within me told me there was more to this than I understood. The next morning, I drove out to the field again, a nervous excitement bubbling up in my chest. The early morning sun cast long shadows, the cool breeze gently swaying the grasses. Everything seemed normal, almost serene. The field looked the same, but I couldn't rid myself of the sense that something wasn't right. I parked my truck at the edge of the field and stepped out. The ground beneath my boots felt solid, but the air? It felt thick. Like something was pressing down, holding me in place. I scanned the horizon. The figures weren't there, not yet. My eyes searched every inch of the field, but it was empty. I almost felt relieved, thinking that maybe I had overreacted yesterday. Maybe it was all in my head. But then, just as I was about to turn back to my truck, I saw them. At first, I thought they were shadows, long and thin. But as I blinked, they became more defined, 4 figures, standing in the same spot as the day before. But this time, they weren't as far away. No. They were closer. Much closer. I swallowed hard. The chill from yesterday was back, a biting cold that seemed to come from nowhere. My breath formed in the air before me, despite the warm weather. I felt an icy shiver creep down my spine. I should have left. I should have gotten in the truck and driven away. But I didn't. I stepped forward, my curiosity getting the better of me. The figures stood still, just like before. They didn't move, but there was something about them that made my stomach twist, something off. The way they were arranged, spaced out evenly, made it seem as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. The longer I stared, the more unsettling it became. I could see them more clearly now, no faces, no discernible features. Just dark, shadow-like shapes, tall and unmoving. They didn't belong in the field. They didn't belong anywhere. I tried to turn and walk back to the truck, but something was wrong. My feet felt heavy, as if the earth itself was pulling me down. I fought it, telling myself it was just the anxiety, the fear I had built up in my mind. But the pull was real. It was like the air around me had thickened, weighing down on me. I tried to take another step, but I couldn't. It was as if the field itself had a grip on me, stopping me from leaving. Then, as I glanced at the figures once more, something changed. The air grew colder, and the shadows around me seemed to stretch and grow. One of the figures, on the far left, moved. Slowly, imperceptibly, but it moved. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, and it was closer. No, not just closer, it was standing at the edge of the field, not far from me. My breath hitched in my throat, panic rising as I looked around. The others hadn't moved, but that one, was advancing, silent and deliberate. My feet finally responded. I turned and sprinted back to my truck, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The wind seemed to pick up around me, pushing against me as if to slow me down, but I didn't stop. The cold pressed in tighter with every step I took, and I could hear the softest whisper in the air behind me, just on the edge of hearing. Don't look back. I didn't dare. I reached the truck, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life as I sped away, not looking in the rearview mirror. But as I glanced to the side, just before I left the field behind me, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of my eye, I caught a flash of movement. A dark figure standing just beyond the truck's lights in the exact spot where I had been moments before. The others were there too, still motionless, still waiting. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I didn't know if I had imagined it or if it had truly been there. I didn't care. I didn't want to know. But I knew one thing for sure. I had to go back. The pull was already starting to settle in again. I couldn't explain it, but I had to go deeper. Something was waiting for me there. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The figures in the field. The chill in the air. The way they moved closer when I wasn't looking. It had all felt too real to ignore, but what was more terrifying was the undeniable feeling that the field had called to me. Every minute that passed, it grew stronger. My mind kept drifting back to that spot in the middle of nowhere, to those figures standing motionless, as if they were waiting for me to make a choice. I could feel it deep in my gut. There was something I needed to understand, something I needed to confront. The following evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the field once more, staring into the growing twilight. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of dark purple and orange. The ground was colder now, the air sharp with the scent of impending nightfall. I had come back with the intent to find answers, to push through the growing unease that clung to me like a second skin. This time, I wasn't alone. Two of my friends, Jake and Sarah, had insisted on coming with me after I told them what had happened the day before. They didn't fully believe me, but they were curious enough to see for themselves. "We'll stick together," Jake said as we walked toward the center of the field, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of apprehension. "Nothing's gonna happen, man. Probably just some weird local story." "I hope you're right," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The moon had risen higher, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The tall grass rustled in the wind, but other than that, it was eerily silent. No animals, no birds, just the sound of our footsteps crunching against the dirt. I glanced over at Sarah. Her face was pale, and she kept looking around nervously, as if she too could feel the strange energy in the air. "Do you see anything?" she asked in a whisper, her voice barely carrying over the wind. I shook my head. "Nothing. But I swear, every time I look away, they're closer. I don't know how." We reached the center of the field. It was where the figures had stood the day before, but now the area was empty. My stomach twisted with a mix of relief and unease. I wanted to believe that it was over, that maybe it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was still out there. We stood there for a long time, the three of us, listening to the quiet around us. Then, suddenly, a cold wind swept through the field, rustling the tall grass like a whispering voice. My heart skipped a beat. That was the same cold I had felt before, the one that seemed to cut through you, leaving a chill that dug deep into your bones. I turned to Jake and Sarah, but they weren't looking at me. They were staring at something else, something in the distance, just beyond the field. "Look," Jake whispered, pointing toward the far side of the field. I followed his gaze, and my breath caught in my throat. There they were. The figures. This time, they were much farther away, standing in a loose line at the edge of the field, their shapes still indistinct but growing clearer with each second. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I realized something was different. They weren't just standing there anymore. They were moving, shifting. But they didn't move like normal people. Their motions were slow, almost deliberate, as if they were gliding across the ground. "They weren't there a second ago," Sarah said, her voice trembling. I tried to explain it away, but deep down I knew I was lying to myself. This wasn't natural. They were moving toward us. Suddenly, I heard it, faint, almost inaudible at first, a whisper. It was so soft, so low, I wasn't sure I heard it at all. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Come closer." The words echoed in my mind, vibrating the air around me. It wasn't just a sound. It was a pull, like something inside me was being drawn toward the figures. I resisted, stepping back, my feet heavy, my body unwilling to obey my mind. "Let's go," I said quickly, trying to shake off the dread creeping into my chest. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, the wind picked up again, this time fierce and unrelenting. The figures seemed to accelerate, closing the distance between us with alarming speed. I looked around, but the field, my surroundings, had changed. The familiar trees and sky had blurred, like a painting left out in the rain. The air felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't see the edge of the field anymore. The figures were closing in fast, their dark shapes becoming more defined. I could see their faces now, faint outlines flickering in the wind, pale and empty. I could feel their eyes on me, their presence overwhelming. The figures weren't just moving, they were surrounding us. I panicked. "We need to get to the truck, now!" I shouted. But as we turned, I saw it. The truck was no longer at the edge of the field. It had vanished. And so had everything else. We were trapped, with no way out. The figures were nearly upon us, their presence growing stronger. "Where are we?" Sarah's voice broke through the terror, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't know. I couldn't explain it. But I knew this, if we didn't leave now, we might never leave. A figure stepped forward, its movement deliberate, its face now clear in the moonlight. And for the first time, I realized these weren't just figures. They were people. People who had been waiting here for a long time. Waiting for us. The night felt oppressive now. The air was thick, almost tangible, and the oppressive silence around me seemed to close in tighter with every step. The silhouettes, those figures that had been motionless before, were no longer where I had last seen them. I had walked around for what seemed like hours, my footsteps muffled by the dense earth beneath my feet, but it didn't feel like time was passing. It was as if the field itself had frozen in place, trapping me in some kind of stasis. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it's the stress, or maybe it's just the darkness. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I turned back to where the figures had stood. And there, just at the edge of my vision, I saw it, a movement. It was subtle, but it was there. One of the figures had shifted slightly, its outline stretching against the shadows, but now it was closer. Far too close. My heart hammered in my chest. No, I'm not imagining this. I took a shaky breath and spun around, my eyes scanning the field, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. My mind raced. What was the connection between the figures and the overwhelming sense of dread? Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me in place, locking me to the spot, forcing me to face what was happening. I could feel the change now. The air had shifted. It was colder. No, it was freezing. the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones, leaving a chilling trail through your veins. I wrapped my arms around myself in an attempt to warm up, but it was futile. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your soul, a cold born of something that didn't belong in this world. It's coming closer. I could feel it. The presence, the growing tension in the air. It was like I was being surrounded, but I couldn't move fast enough to escape. The sound of something dragging along the ground reached my ears, a slow, deliberate scrape, as though something was shifting in the dirt. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing. Then I saw it. One of the figures, its face now faintly visible in the dark. It was wrong. Its features didn't make sense. There was no clarity to it, just a mass of shadows and burning, flickering eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. It seemed to be staring directly at me, its hollow gaze pulling me deeper into the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a stumbling step back. The figure moved. I didn't see it shift, it was just suddenly closer, impossibly closer. I felt the blood drain from my face, the weight of the cold sinking deeper. And then it spoke. "Help me." The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something chilling in the way it sounded. It was distorted, hollow, as if the words were being dragged from a place where they didn't belong. "Please, help me." My legs froze in place, my mind racing for an explanation. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a hallucination. But as I stood there, the words of the figure echoed in my ears, and I realized the truth. The figures weren't just watching me, they were drawing me closer. They were part of this world. They were something else. Suddenly, the figure lunged. I didn't see it move, it was simply there, in front of me, its cold eyes staring into mine. The words it had spoken turned into a shrill scream that rang in my ears, and before I could react, the darkness around me swallowed me whole. I struggled, trying to break free, but it was futile. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and the coldness was suffocating. Everything was spinning, the darkness wrapping around me like a tightening noose. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. I stood in the middle of the field, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures were gone, but I wasn't alone. The sense of being watched was palpable. I turned slowly, my eyes searching, but there was nothing. Only the tall, whispering plants swaying gently in the breeze. I should have left. But now, something told me that no matter how far I ran, I would never escape this place. The field, the figures, the cold, everything was connected. And I had stepped into it, unknowingly. I stood there, my body trembling from the cold and the shock, trying to shake off the horror that gripped me. The field around me seemed unchanged, yet it felt like I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. It felt like the ground beneath me had shifted, like the very fabric of the air had been altered in some terrifying way. My thoughts scrambled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Was it just my mind breaking? But even as I tried to reason with myself, the sensation of eyes watching me, following my every move, refused to let up. I wasn't alone. Something was still out there. I forced myself to move, my legs reluctant, the fear still gnawing at me. The silence had returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was heavy, like the silence before a storm, too still, too unnatural. As I walked, the tall grass whispered around me, but there was no wind. It was as though the field itself was holding its breath. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. But I didn't need to see the figures to know they were there. I could feel them always just out of sight, always just behind me. I quickened my pace, my heart beat loud in my ears. The further I moved, the more the darkness seemed to close in on me. The trees surrounding the field, which should have been distant, now appeared much too close. The night had become thicker, as though the shadows themselves were pressing in, drawing tighter and tighter around me. Focus, just focus. Get out of here. Find a way back to the road. But the road felt miles away, as though the very landscape itself had conspired to stretch the distance between me and escape. Every step I took seemed to make the field bigger, the horizon farther. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, I heard it. A faint sound, distant but unmistakable, footsteps. It was so quiet at first, just a soft crunch on the dry earth. But as I froze, the sound grew louder, closer, more deliberate. It was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was following me. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no one. The field was empty. The figures were gone, but I knew they hadn't left. They were waiting for me. I turned again, and there, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. A shape. A silhouette standing just at the edge of the field, barely visible in the shadows. I could feel it staring at me, its presence like a pressure on my chest. I could almost hear it breathing, slow and measured, as though it knew I was watching, as though it wanted me to see it. A cold chill ran down my spine. I had to move. I started running, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. But no matter how fast I ran, the figures never seemed to fall behind. They were still there, always there, just beyond the corner of my eye, waiting. Each step I took felt heavier, as though the field itself was trying to pull me back. And then the sound returned. This time, it was louder, unmistakable, footsteps, right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was closer now, its shape clearer. It was taller than any person I had ever seen, its face obscured in shadow, but those glowing eyes, those burning eyes, cut through the darkness, locking onto mine. Help me. The voice again, but this time it was not just one voice. It was a chorus. 1,000 whispers. 1,000 screams that echoed in my head. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, and that's when I realized. The field had changed. It was closing in around me. The trees, the plants, everything had shifted. The path I had been following had vanished, and in its place was a dense, twisting maze of tall grass. I was lost. I was trapped. And the figures were closing in. There was no escape. I could hear their movements now, not just behind me, but all around me. They were circling, slowly, deliberately. The sound of shuffling feet, the breath of things that didn't belong here, it was all around me. And then I heard something that sent a wave of icy terror through me. A whisper. Right in my ear. Stay with us. I froze. The voice was close, too close. But there was no one there. Nothing behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest, but the field was empty again. No figures, no movement, nothing. I was alone. Or so I thought. Before I could take another breath, a figure emerged from the grass, rising out of the shadows. It was closer than before, much closer. And it wasn't alone. There were more. Dozens of them. All standing silently, their glowing eyes fixed on me. The cold was unbearable now, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air felt thin, like I was suffocating, and the figures didn't move. They just stood there, their hollow eyes burning into mine. "Help me," the voice repeated, but now it sounded wrong, distorted, like it was being spoken through the cracks of the earth itself. The realization hit me then, harder than a cold. I was the one who was lost. Not in the field, but in their world. The figures were no longer shadows. They were here. They were real. And they weren't going to let me go. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.